first of all say something about nationalism, and my view is that nationalism involves different component parts. To begin with, nationalism must involve some theory of the polity. I mean, after all, nationalism is a property of a state, or more generally conceived of a polity, so it must have something to do with that. At the same time, it must have something to do with forms of allegiance or attachment to public power in a polity. So they're the two things that I want to consider, but let me take the first one first. That's to say, nationalism as relevant to the theory of a polity, because in a way this is the trickier one, because that in turn involves two subordinate concepts, if you like. First of all, with any polity, obviously it's constituted by a population, and if it's constituted by a population, it must involve some view of what constitutes a people, what constitutes the Romans, what constitutes the Athenians, what constitutes the Russians. But at the same time, doesn't just involve, as it were, the way in which a population comes to constitute a people, but also the form of regime under which they exist. So it's a theory, as it were, of peoplehood and a theory of regime form. So that's the theory of the state component. The second component is allegiance under it, or attachment to the polity. Sometimes this is called patriotism, or loyalty, or identification, which is sometimes why nationalism becomes involved in discussion about identity, because of identification with the polity. Or equally, identification with one another, that's to say the people themselves as constituting the polity. So that's nationalism generally, you might say, and that's a very general phenomenon. But what we're interested in is modern nationalism, and therefore it must have some particularly modern characteristics. And I would say when people talk about modern nationalism, therefore, they are thinking of very particular developments which have influenced these other components of nationalism, which I've already discussed. And it seems to me the most important ones that they're interested in is the fact that in modern European and Western and more widely distributed also history, the idea that the people in the last instance are sovereign appears to be something approaching a modern notion, and it's certainly a notion that has influenced the modern conception of nationalism. So popular sovereignty is an important component of modern nationalism, but also, as I said, since the regime form is also relevant, the modern constitutional representative republic, or as it's sometimes called, democracy, is also a fundamental component of modern nationalism. And it seems to me that at the same time, nature of allegiance has changed over time. And so modern allegiance is obviously not the same as, allegiance in the 14th century Ottoman Empire. Modern allegiance seems to me to be based on notions of popular consent, although it's also true that even modern allegiance based on a notion of popular consent is still often drawing on older notions of tradition. And so the problem with nationalism is that all these components of modern states become involved in the discussion, and so it's an enormously confused field. It seems to me also that this confusion was not alleviated, but was rather intensified by modern academic discussion of nationalism. And this has occurred at various stages throughout the 20th century, but it had a sort of rebirth in the 1980s when several books were suddenly published on nationalism at the same time. For instance, Eric Hobsbawm published a book on nationalism. Ernest Gellner wrote very influentially on nationalism. Benedict Anderson wrote influentially on nationalism. and then this curious quasi-anthropologically oriented sociologist, A.D. Smith, wrote about nationalism. But it seems to me that each of them, rather than writing about the phenomenon, has written about a component element. Now, the most common component element to be written about is this aspect of identification and allegiance. But it seems to me that this is potentially tremendously nebulous, because the idea of groups of people in society identifying with one another, this can cover any number of groups, subgroups and sub-subgroups. So the notion of mutual identification, or even personal identity, or just identity generally, seems to me to capture just too little to serve very well as a theory of nationalism. So identity studies, if we can call it that, seem to me to have gotten everything off on the wrong foot and encouraged a rather beleaguered direction of travel, which has ended up with us understanding less about nationalism as a result of the nationalist studies than we did before they ever started. It seems to me that if you're going to understand nationalism, you're talking about those components that I've talked about in connection with projects of political power. That's to say, if it's about popular identification, it's popular identification with the state. So you can't just have a theory of, as it were, what brings the people together as a people. You must also have a theory of the form of politics in which that takes place. So that's why it seems to me it's become conceptually rather complicated, even though it's clearly a phenomenon that's all around us and has been for the last 200 years or so. So it does have historical reality, and it does really exist in the world. But because it brings together this diverse range of features, scholars have often focused on one of them to the detriment of understanding the fuller picture, and that, as it were, partial perspective seems to be distorting. Now, the reason that we're discussing nationalism is because it became, it seems to me, a very peculiar and forceful principle in the modern world at the point at which European empires began to disintegrate. If you're thinking about European history, we're really talking about the history not of competing nation states. That's how we sort of remember the history. We're actually talking about the history of competing empires. The Russian Empire, the British Empire, the French Empire, even the Germans had to go at it. The Spanish Empire is, of course, a massive part of Spanish history, and the Portuguese, and so on and so forth. What happens increasingly, basically in the aftermath of the French Revolution, is the disintegration of these world power blocks. And they disintegrate under pressure from the appeal of a modern ideology, the ideology of popular sovereignty. But as soon as populations started to appeal to popular sovereignty as their underlying legitimating principle, the question is, well, which people is the bearer of this popular sovereignty? And this doctrine had, if you like, a disaggregative or disintegrating effect on constituted power across the world. So the component parts of the Ottoman Empire fell prey to this, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, of the Russian Empire, and as I said, of the British and French as well. So nationalism was basically the language of emergent people's power in the era of the disintegration of European empires. So it seems to me its heyday was 1789, gathering pace then after the 1848 revolutions, then again gathering new momentum, especially after the First and Second World Wars, when all these forces, the forces of international politics, are forced to realign themselves. So I suppose the question is that still with us? And it seems to me it's inevitably going to be with us as long as our fundamental legitimating principle is the notion that the people are democratically responsible for themselves, as long as we live without our ideology, the potential for newly emergent peoples claiming that right is going to be with us as well. So nationalism certainly has a future, because we are still living in the era of the notion that populations are self